Have you ever just, wished for a true, unquestionable reset button? I mean, like a real second chance after a catastrophic, totally undeniable failure.
Oh, absolutely. I think everyone has at some point.
Right. And, usually when we talk about a comeback, whether it's an athlete who had a career-ending injury or a business that went bankrupt or even a whole society that has just completely collapsed, there's this underlying expectation of magic.
Yeah, like we're waiting for a stroke of luck or something.
Exactly. We wait for the stars to align. We pray for some external force to just swoop in, wave a magic wand, and, I don't know, fix everything.
It's an incredibly comforting thought, honestly. We really like to believe that redemption is this gift that just falls from the sky once we've suffered enough.
Yeah, like there's a quota.
Right, as if the universe has a quota for pain, and once you hit it, you just get a free pass back to the top.
But then you step into the framework we're exploring today, and suddenly all that magical thinking is completely shattered. We're looking at a landscape that is brutally rational. I mean, there is no quota for suffering. There is no fairy dust.
No, not at all. It is the absolute definition of cause and effect. It strips away that comforting illusion of arbitrary favors and leaves you with just the cold, clear mechanics of action and consequence.
It really does.
It essentially asks you to look in the mirror and realize that the only thing getting you out of the hole is the exact same mechanism that put you in it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today we are going on a deep dive into what we're calling the blueprint for a comeback. We're examining a very specific set of sources here. It's Lecture 3 of 17 from the Tolu-e-Islam series by the scholar Ghulam Ahmed Parwez.
And specifically, this lecture explores the themes of rise, fall, and absolute responsibility, which are
Right. Now, before we jump into the deep end, I do want to establish our ground rules for you listening. Our mission here isn't to endorse a specific theology or take a religious or political side. We really aren't here to preach.
Exactly. We are just looking at the text.
Yeah. Our goal is to impartially report on the fascinating philosophical and psychological framework presented in this source material. We are looking closely at Ayat 6, where the Bani Israel, the children of Israel, are given their turn or their chance to rise again.
And the central question we are going to ponder alongside you today is really profound. What are the rational, not magical conditions that allow a defeated nation or even an individual to rise once more?
So to really grasp the gravity of the answer the text provides, we have to anchor ourselves in the history that the lecture uses to set the stage. Because the source material doesn't just talk about a minor setback.
Oh, no. It details two major catastrophic historical destructions of the Bani Israel. And when I say catastrophic, I want you to really visualize the scale of the devastation. The first was at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, around 600 BC.
And this wasn't just, losing a battle and paying a tax to the victor.
Not at all. It was a complete cultural obliteration. The Babylonians didn't just conquer them, they uprooted them. They were taken as slaves to Babylon.
Which is just wild to think about.
Right. They lost their geographical center, which is devastating enough for any civilization, but it goes so much deeper than that. Over the course of this exile, they literally lost their language.
Okay, imagine that. An entire generation growing up unable to speak the tongue of their ancestors.
Unable to read their own history.
That is the literal definition of a cultural wipeout. I mean, if you lose your language, you lose the operating system of your society's memory.
Exactly. And to make matters even more absolute, their original scriptures were destroyed. Their central texts, the very blueprint of their identity and laws, were just gone.
It was a total societal collapse.
It was. The psychological devastation of that, the feeling of being entirely abandoned by history, with zero hope of recovery, it's really hard to overstate. Yet, the text notes, this was eventually reversed. Decades later, they were aided by Cyrus the Great of Persia, who conquered Babylon and allowed them to return to their homeland and rebuild.
Okay, so that is destruction and comeback number one. They hit absolute rock bottom. They lose their language, their books, their home, and somehow they get a second chance. They actually rebuild.
They do rebuild, but then comes the second destruction. The text notes that after getting this incredible second chance, they eventually fell back into the exact same destructive patterns.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the social inequalities, the ignoring of permanent laws, they brought it all back. And this led to the second major catastrophe, this time at the hands of the Roman general Titus in 70 AD.
And the Romans were notoriously thorough when they wanted to send the message.
Thorough is definitely the right word. Titus completely decimated their center in Jerusalem. He destroyed the Second Temple, leaving almost nothing but a single wall standing.
Just brutal.
And this didn't just lead to an exile to a neighboring kingdom, it led to a massive diaspora. The people were scattered across the globe. This is actually where the historical moniker of the Wandering Jews originated, as they were left without a central home, scattered across continents for nearly 2 millennia.
2 millennia. The scale of that timeline is just dizzying. We are talking about 2,000 years of wandering, of being minorities in other people's empires, all stemming from that destruction in 70 AD.
It's a massive span of time.
But what I find so compelling about this source material is that it uses this intense, sprawling history, not just as a storytelling device to, evoke pity or awe. It uses it as a rigid clinical framework to explain a universal concept. The text calls it the law of requital, or makafat imal.
Yes, that is the core of the entire lecture. The idea is that a civilization's fate, any civilization at any point in history, is tied strictly and unalterably to its adherence to permanent, rational laws.
So it's not about being a chosen people who get special favors.
Exactly. It's about whether or not you align with the mechanics of the universe.
So if we're moving from these massive historical events down to the underlying mechanics of why those events happened, we have to establish the source's primary argument. The universe operates on cause and effect, not arbitrary whims.
Right.
And this brings us to a massive, myth-busting concept in the text. We really need to deconstruct the idea of generational punishment, because I think a lot of people, when they hear about a group suffering for 2,000 years, they immediately jump to the idea of a curse.
It's a very common psychological trap, and frankly, you can find this idea in various traditional interpretations across many cultures, that a group of people might suffer for hundreds or thousands of years because of the specific sins of their ancestors.
Like a generational curse that you just inherit.
Yeah, almost like a genetic disease. You are born and you are already guilty.
It's the idea that your great-great-grandfather made a terrible mistake, and so God, or the universe, decides that you, centuries later, still have to pay the interest on that moral debt. It removes all personal agency. It essentially says, well, my life is terrible, but it's not my fault, it's my ancestors' fault.
And the text we are examining today explicitly and aggressively rejects this idea. It argues that this entire concept is a profound misunderstanding of how universal laws operate. The lecture states very clearly the Bani Israel did not suffer for 2,000 years in the diaspora because of what their ancestors did in Jerusalem in 70 AD.
Wait, let me make sure I'm getting this right. If the ancestors caused the destruction that led to the diaspora, how are the subsequent generations not suffering because of the ancestors? They are the ones who lost the homeland.
Because the text insists on a continuous chain of individual responsibility. Yes, the ancestors lost the homeland. But the continued suffering, the continued state of degradation, generation after generation, was not a lingering punishment from the past.
Then what was it?
It was because each subsequent generation actively repeated the same rebellious, destructive behaviors. The crimes, the social imbalances, the corruptions, each new generation made the active choice to initiate those actions again in whatever society they found themselves in.
Okay, I see the distinction. You might inherit a difficult situation, you might inherit a broken world. But your moral standing and your ultimate fate are determined by what you do in that broken world. It's not a genetic defect of morality that gets passed down.
To take that a step further, the text argues that if a subsequent generation had truly changed their actions and aligned themselves with the permanent values, the curse would have been broken instantly. Because there is no curse. There is only the ongoing consequence of ongoing action.
Which brings us directly into the mechanics of the law of requital, makafat iamal. The lecture breaks down Ayat 7 of Surah 17, which states, and I quote, "If you do good, it is for your own selves, and if you do evil, it is against yourselves."
It's incredibly direct.
Yeah, initiative always comes from the human being.
It frames this as an immutable law of nature. It's as reliable as gravity. You drop a stone, it falls. You initiate an action of exploitation. You degrade your own society.
I was just going to say, I think of this like physics. It's Newton's third law, applied to human morality and social structure. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction.
It's a great way to look at it.
But here's where I want to push back, or at least explore the friction between this framework and how most of us were raised to think about religion or cosmic justice. Doesn't traditional theology often teach that God is actively micromanaging these punishments?
Oh, definitely.
Like, you do a bad thing, God observes it, God gets angry, and God actively decides to throw a lightning bolt at your specific civilization.
That traditionalist view, the micromanaging, emotionally reactive deity, is exactly what the source material is trying to dismantle. If we connect this to the broader philosophical picture the lecture is drawing, it clarifies that God's law acts much more like a shadow.
A shadow. Unpack that for a second.
So, the shadow doesn't decide where to go, it follows the path the human chooses. God doesn't force the human down a specific path. Rather, the divine law guarantees the consequence of whichever path is initiated by the human.
Okay, I'm following.
The text uses the analogy of a crossroads. If a person chooses the wrong path, the law of consequences corresponding to that wrong path immediately attaches to them. It follows them. There is no arbitrary changing of God's mind midway down the road because you asked nicely.
So God isn't sitting on a throne flipping a coin on whether to punish you today or let it slide. The system is entirely automated. You step on the tripwire, the alarm goes off. Every single time.
The lecture actually cites other ayats from Surah 33 and 48 to prove that this law is completely unalterable. The Arabic phrasing used emphasizes that you will never find a change in the way God operates.
It's a closed system.
Yes, you cannot bribe the law of gravity to let you float today, and you cannot bribe the law of requital to overlook your corruption.
Which perfectly explains the lecture's incredibly strong rebuttal of intercession. If the system is automated and unalterable, then the whole concept of having someone else bail you out spiritually just completely falls apart.
Precisely. The text strongly dismisses the concept of transferable good deeds.
I can't just borrow my neighbor's good grades because I partied instead of studying for the test.
Or, in a more traditional context, you cannot rely on the piety of a saint, a prophet, or a deceased ancestor to wipe away the consequences of your own actions. You can't say, well, I exploited my workers, but my grandfather built a hospital, so we are even.
The law of requital doesn't do that kind of math.
It really doesn't. Furthermore, uttering empty words of repentance, just saying I'm sorry over and over while continuing to act corruptly, does absolutely nothing.
Because words don't change the physics of the situation.
Exactly. If you poison a well, standing next to the well and apologizing to the water doesn't make the water safe to drink.
That is a great analogy.
The action must change. You have to physically clean the well. The law only responds to action.
Okay, so if our actions strictly determine our outcomes, and there's no magical eraser, how do we understand the concept of destiny? Because people love to talk about things being meant to be.
They do.
This is where the lecture takes a really profound linguistic deep dive, redefining the very concept of fate. We're looking at Ayat 13 now.
What's fascinating here is the text focus entirely on this one verse. It says, "We have fastened every man's fate to his own neck." The Arabic word used here for fate is tayarahu.
Fastened to his own neck. That is such a vivid, almost suffocating image. It feels heavy.
It is meant to feel inescapable, but not in the way we traditionally think of destiny. The lecture contrasts the traditionalist view of destiny, which usually imagines a pre-written script, an inescapable fate that God wrote for you in some cosmic ledger before you were even born.
Right, the traditional view.
Yeah, it contrasts that with a highly rational, action-based interpretation. According to the source, your fate is not a script handed to you. Rather, your fate is the accumulated record of your own actions, literally hung around your own neck.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. When I was reading that part of the source, trying to visualize a record of actions hung around a neck, the first thing I thought of was an airplane's black box, a flight data recorder.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right. Imagine a wearable black box that every person is born with or perhaps legally required to wear, and they can never, ever take it off. Every word you speak, every decision you make, every shortcut you take in your business, every time you lie to your spouse, it is all permanently recorded on this device hanging around your neck.
Oh.
It's not a script telling you what to do, it's a ledger recording what you did.
That is a brilliant modern translation of the concept of Tairahu. It is a continuous, undeniable, unhackable data log of your initiative.
Huh.
You are writing your destiny in real time, line by line, action by action.
Wow.
And this concept of the undeniable ledger ties directly into the text's unique linguistic breakdown of the afterlife, specifically the concepts of heaven and hell.
Yes, this part completely blew my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Because usually, heaven and hell are depicted so literally, clouds and harps versus fire and pitchforks. But the lecture goes in a completely different, almost psychological or evolutionary direction.
Right.
Walk us through how the text redefines Jahannam and Jannat.
The lecture takes a strict linguistic approach to the word Jahannam, which is the Arabic word commonly translated as hell. It defines Jahannam not merely as a physical pit of literal fire where you burn forever, but as a cul-de-sac.
A cul-de-sac.
Yeah, a state of being absolutely blocked or stagnant.
Mhm.
The key Arabic term highlighted here is hasira,
Hasira.
stagnation.
Yes. According to this framework, hell is the cessation of human evolutionary progress.
I really want to pause and linger on this because it's such a massive departure from the norm. Stagnation as hell. If you think about it, in biology, when an organism stops adapting, stops moving, stops evolving, it dies. Stagnation is death.
To take it out of biology and put it into psychology, think about what it feels like when you are totally stuck in life, when you hit a dead end.
We've all been there. Right. When your previous bad decisions have completely eroded your capacity to develop your potential any further. You've burned all your bridges, your habits have destroyed your health, your deceit has left you isolated, and you are trapped in a state of blocked momentum. You look at the future, and there is nowhere left to go. That is Hasira. That is hell.
Man, that is bleak.
It's the ultimate loss of future opportunity. You are stuck with the crushing consequences of your own black box, and you cannot move forward.
It's almost like a suffocating room that keeps shrinking. You did the actions that built the walls, and now you are trapped inside them. And conversely, Jannat, or heaven, what is the linguistic root there?
Jannat is described as continuous forward momentum. It is the evolution of the self continuing uninterrupted. If you have aligned your actions with the rational laws, if you haven't built walls of deceit and corruption around yourself, your potential is not blocked.
So you just keep going.
Exactly. Your path remains open, and you continue to develop, to discover, to progress. Heaven, in this framework, is not just a static state of sitting around on a cloud being bored for eternity. It's the joy of endless, unblocked evolution.
Wow. Okay, so the rules of the game, as laid out in this lecture, are actually incredibly clear. It's pure cause and effect. The black box around your neck records everything. You are either building a path to forward momentum, or you are building the walls of a cul-de-sac.
That's it, in a nutshell.
But this raises a massive, glaring question that I struggled with the entire time I was reading the source. If the rules are this clear, and if the consequences of stagnation, of Hasira, are so terrifying and inevitable, why do humans consistently, generation after generation, make choices that lead to their own destruction? Why do we keep walking into the cul-de-sac?
That is the crucial pivot, and it's exactly where the lecture goes next. It recognizes that establishing the cosmic laws isn't enough. We have to understand why we break them. It transitions from physics into human psychology, specifically tackling the fatal flaw in human processing, the trap of short-termism.
Okay, let's get into it. We are looking now at Ayat 11.
The text calls it the prayer for evil.
The prayer for evil. Sounds ominous.
Yes. Ayat 11 states a profound psychological truth. It says, man prays for evil as earnestly as he prays for good, because man is inherently hasty. The Arabic word the text focuses on is ajul.
Ajul. Hasty. We are in a rush. We want it now.
We are totally obsessed with immediate results. The lecture breaks down this concept, explaining that humans are biologically and psychologically wired to prioritize immediate gain. The term the lecture uses is afmadi ajal.
Afmadi ajal.
Yes, and we prioritize it at the severe expense of long-term survival. We want the profit now, we want the pleasure now, we want the relief from anxiety now. Even if getting it right now guarantees our absolute destruction tomorrow, we just lack temporal depth.
And the source uses a really intense, memorable analogy to illustrate this biological flaw. The poisoned pulau. Let's paint this picture for the listener because it really stuck with me.
It's a stark, almost visceral metaphor. The text asks you to imagine a man who is absolutely starving. He hasn't eaten in days. His hunger is agonizing. His stomach is cramping. His brain is screaming for calories.
He's desperate.
Beyond desperate. Someone walks into the room and presents him with a delicious, steaming, fragrant plate of pulau, a rich, savory rice and meat dish. Naturally, his immediate, overwhelming animal instinct is to rush forward, grab it with both hands, and devour it to end his pain.
The afamidi jaw, the immediate gain.
Exactly. However, the text adds a condition. If that starving man is reliably informed, without a shadow of a doubt, that the pulau contains a lethal dose of arsenic, what does he do?
Well, the lecture says a rational man will stop. He will endure the immediate agonizing pain of hunger to preserve his long-term life. He will look at the food, his mouth will water, his stomach will cramp, but his brain will say, if I eat that, I die. So he won't eat the poison.
Precisely. The rational man calculates the long-term loss against the immediate gain and chooses to suffer now to live later. He suppresses the ajul, the haste.
But that's the ideal scenario.
Right, but the text argues that in the realm of morality and society, humans act like the starving man who eats the arsenic anyway, just because it smells good in the moment. We take the bribe, we exploit the worker, we lie on the contract, knowing somewhere deep down it rots the foundation of our society. But the immediate profit tastes too good to pass up.
Okay, I have to step in here and really play devil's advocate, or at least admit some deep sympathy for the hasty human in this scenario. Because it is incredibly easy for us to sit here analyzing a philosophical text and say, oh, just don't eat the poison pulau. Just think long term.
It is easy to say.
But I want to talk about the reality of human pressure. Think about a person trying to feed their family in a deeply corrupt economy. I'm talking about a place where the systems are completely broken. If everyone around you is taking bribes, and taking a bribe is literally the only way to get your sick kid medicine today, the pressure to eat the poison pulau isn't just about greed. It feels like survival.
It does.
If you don't take the bribe, your kid suffers today. Telling that person to think about their spiritual black box feels almost cruel. How does the framework handle that extreme level of immediate suffering?
That is probably the most important pushback you could offer, and it goes right to the heart of why the lecture introduces a very specific and somewhat surprising definition of secularism. The text isn't blind to that suffering. It actually acknowledges that if your timeline is short enough, taking the bribe is actually the only mathematically logical choice.
Wait, really? The text admits that?
Yes. The text uses the term secularism not in the modern political sense of separating church and state, but in a very specific philosophical way. In this context, secularism is defined fundamentally as a worldview restricted only to the immediate physical lifespan.
Meaning, you believe that the 70 or 80 years you get in this physical biological body is the entirety of your existence. Once the brain stops, the lights go out forever.
Exactly. Now let's put your desperate parent back into that worldview. If you truly believe this physical life is all there is, your rational math completely changes. You will naturally and logically prioritize immediate gains because there is no long-term beyond your physical death.
That makes a dark kind of sense.
If you are going to cease to exist, and if your child is going to cease to exist, avoiding pain in the present moment becomes the highest possible good. Why not take the bribe to get the medicine today? The corruption makes logical sense if the physical lifespan is the only metric of profit and loss. You eat the poison pulau because you figure you're going to die eventually anyway, so you might as well not be hungry today.
I see. So if the timeline is short, bad behavior is highly rationalized. So what is the antidote? How does the text demand we change the math?
By forcibly extending the timeline. The antidote is true belief in the future. The text uses the term akhirat, which refers to the life after, the ultimate long term. Belief in this continued existence of the self, the idea that your black box doesn't get destroyed when your body dies, is the only rational engine that allows a person to delay gratification under extreme pressure.
So it's not about blind faith, like, oh, God will be mad at me. It's an extension of logical calculation.
Perfectly stated. If you know that your black box continues beyond physical death, the arsenic in the bribe becomes visible. You realize the long-term damage to your true self, the creation of that internal cul-de-sac, the hasira, far outweighs the temporary physical gain of the bribe.
It changes the equation completely.
It gives you the logical scaffolding needed to endure the immediate pain of standing against a corrupt system.
Okay, I follow the logic. If I extend my timeline to eternity, I can endure a bad day, a bad year, or even bad lifetime because I'm playing a much longer game.
Yeah.
But this introduces another massive problem.
What's that?
Even if I extend my timeline, how do I actually know what is a poisoned short-term gain and what is a genuinely beneficial long-term choice?
Right.
Because human beings are absolute masters of rationalization. We can convince ourselves that almost anything is good for us in the long run.
We really can. And that is exactly what the source material addresses in Section 4, Permanent Values in a Shifting World. The lecture explicitly tackles the problem of human rationalization. It notes that human intellect alone, just our raw brain power, is severely limited and often incredibly biased when it comes to defining absolute good and evil.
I mean, history is full of brilliant intellectuals who justified horrific atrocities because they thought it was good for the long-term survival of their specific group.
Exactly. The lecture even references Socrates and the long history of Greek philosophical struggles to nail down objective definitions of virtue. The problem is that when we rely purely on our own intellects, we inevitably end up with relative values.
Relative values, meaning what's good for me might be terrible for you, but I'm going to call it good anyway because I'm the one making the rules.
Yes. Relative values shift based on personal or tribal benefit. The text gives a great example of this economic double standard. Under relative values, a business loss is considered universally bad. If a merchant loses a shipment, he mourns it.
Naturally.
But if that same merchant secures a massive profit through deception, fraud, or artificially inflating prices during a famine, he rationalizes that as good. Why? Because it benefited him. His intellect justifies his greed by changing the definition of good to mean profitable for me.
It's like the CEO who dumps toxic waste into the river to save millions in disposal fees and tells his board of directors he made a good long-term choice for the shareholders. His intellect is working perfectly, but his values are relative to his stock price.
That's exactly it.
So the source material argues that if we want to survive, we cannot rely on our own easily manipulated brains to define the rules. We need an external measure.
We need an objective measuring stick. The text points to Ayat 9, which states that the Quran provides permanent values. The Arabic term is aqwam. These values are not subject to human voting, they don't fluctuate with market trends, and they cannot be bent by personal rationalizations. They are absolute. They act as a fixed compass.
And the lecture uses a really beautiful poetic metaphor here to illustrate the difference between human relative values and these permanent values. The metaphor of the night and the dawn.
It's such a powerful image. It compares humanity operating solely on relative values to a person stumbling through a treacherous landscape in the pitch dark of night. In the dark, a person might see a sudden, brilliant flash of lightning. They think, light, and they chase after it, thinking it will guide them.
But the lightning is temporary.
It vanishes in a second, and they are plunged back into darkness, usually further off the path than they were before.
Chasing lightning strikes.
Yeah.
That is exactly what chasing quarterly profits or temporary political power feels like. It's a flash of success, and then you're blind again.
Precisely. But the revelation of these permanent values, the aqwam, is compared not to lightning, but to the dawn.
The sun coming up?
The dawn doesn't flash. It slowly, inevitably rises, providing a consistent, unshifting light by which you can navigate the entire landscape. In the daylight of permanent values, you can clearly see the pitfalls, the cliffs, and the safe paths. You don't have to guess if the pulau is poisoned. The light reveals it clearly.
And part of seeing clearly in that daylight is realizing the ultimate illusion of physical wealth. The text has this stark, almost chilling reminder about death to illustrate why optimizing for the physical world is such a bad calculation.
It talks about the absolute great equalizer. It says, imagine a man who wears a bespoke 1,000-rupee Rankin suit, a custom-tailored symbol of ultimate status and wealth in that era. Now imagine a man who wears the most common threadbare, coarse clothes.
The billionaire and the beggar.
Yes. The text points out that the result is exactly the same at the moment of physical death. Both sets of clothes are stripped from them. You do not get to take the suit into the grave.
You don't get to take the bank account, the real estate portfolio, the luxury cars, or the millions of social media followers. It all stays on this side of the line.
Nothing physical crosses over. The text asserts that the only thing that moves forward, the only thing that survives the transition of physical death, is your nafs.
The nafs. Let's define that clearly for the listener. We're talking about the self, the core personality, the consciousness.
Yes, the I inside of you. Therefore, if you spend your entire physical lifespan of 80 years optimizing only for physical wealth, if you cheat, lie, and hoard just to get the better suit, you have made a catastrophic, irrational miscalculation of profit and loss.
A huge mistake.
You have spent your whole life gathering a mountain of currency that is completely invalid in the next stage of your evolution. You've essentially hoarded monopoly money while ignoring the actual currency of the nafs, which is the development of your character through adherence to prominent values.
Okay, this is where the deep dive gets incredibly intense. Let's unpack the mechanics of this. If our nafs, our conscious self, our personality is the only thing that survives, how is its true condition actually recorded? And how is it ultimately revealed?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because going back to my earlier point about rationalization, we are really, really good at lying to ourselves. I can convince myself I'm a saint while acting like a monster. We transition here into what the outline calls social physics and the psychology of accountability. This covers ayats 14 and 15, and honestly, this might be the most fascinating part of the entire lecture.
It is perhaps the most psychologically profound section of the source material. It focuses on Ayat 14, which translates to, read your book, your own self is sufficient today as an accountant against you.
Read your book. That ties right back to the wearable black box metaphor we discussed earlier. The tairahu fastened to the neck.
Exactly. It's the reading of the data. Now, the text looks at this on two levels. On a macro level, it treats this book as a transparent ledger of a civilization's data. You don't need a historian to tell you if a society was just or corrupt. The data is recorded in the very reality of their social structure.
Like poverty rates.
The poverty rates, the inequality, the collapse of institutions, the society itself is the open book. But on a micro, individual level, the lecture draws a fascinating, startlingly modern parallel. It likens this open book to the Freudian concept of the unconscious mind.
This blew me away when I read the notes. Applying 20th century psychoanalysis, Freud's theories of the mind, to a 7th century religious text. Walk us through exactly how the lecture models the human mind.
So the lecture sets up a dichotomy between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. The conscious mind is the face we present to the world, and more importantly, it's the face we present to ourselves.
Yeah.
It is the part of us that makes excuses. It is the master of spin. It lies. It rationalizes corrupt behavior. It tells us, I only took that bribe to help my family, or I only ruined that colleague's career because they deserved it and I needed the promotion.
I wrote this down in my margins while prepping. The conscious mind is the PR department of the brain. Its entire job is to write press releases making you look good, even when you're doing terrible things.
That's a perfect way to describe it. But beneath that PR department, making up roughly 9/10 of the mind's actual volume, is the unconscious. And the unconscious mind does not buy the PR.
It doesn't care about the spin.
Not at all. The text notes that the unconscious mind acts as the ultimate unhackable recording device. It accurately and ruthlessly records every deceit, every rationalization, every hidden motive, and every selfish impulse. It logs the raw, unvarnished truth of our actions, entirely devoid of the conscious mind's spin.
So the conscious mind writes a press release saying, I am a good person doing a hard thing for noble reasons, but deep down in the basement, the unconscious mind writes down in the ledger action motivated by greed, fear, and a desire to dominate.
Exactly. And this leads to what the text describes as an internal civil war on the day of reckoning. This is the true meaning of Ayat 14. When it says your own self is sufficient today as an accountant against you, it means no external witnesses are needed. The universe doesn't need to call your neighbors to testify against you. God doesn't need to play a videotape of your sin.
You don't need a jury. You don't need a prosecutor pointing a finger.
You don't need any of that. The unconscious mind is simply unrolled. The text uses the imagery of a scroll being opened wide. The unconscious testifies against the conscious mind. All the hidden truth, the actual motives behind every smile and every handshake burst to the surface of your awareness.
That is intense.
The nafs is presented with its own undeniable raw data. It acts as its own judge and executioner because it cannot deny the reality of its own ledger. The psychological torment of that realization, seeing the absolute naked truth of your own self-deception with nowhere left to hide, is profound. It is the realization of the hasira, the cul-de-sac, built by your own hands.
That is utterly terrifying. The idea that my own mind is keeping a secret, completely objective file on me, and one day I'm going to have to read it out loud to myself. But at the same time, it's incredibly just. There's no rigged jury. There's no misunderstanding of your intentions. It is pure justice.
It is the ultimate fairness.
Which brings us to the final point in the source material, Ayat 15. The text says, whoever is guided is for his own self. Whoever goes astray is against his own self. No bearer of burdens will bear another's. I have to point out the absolute, almost clinical fairness of this system. You literally do not carry your neighbor's sins. You don't carry your father's sins, going back to our earlier point about generational curses. Your black box is yours alone.
It is the ultimate expression of radical personal responsibility. No one can save you, but also no one can doom you except yourself. And the lecture concludes this dense philosophical section by highlighting the final critical guarantee provided in the second half of Ayat 15. We never punish until we have sent a messenger.
Meaning, the rules of the game are always explained before the game begins. You don't get penalized for breaking a law you didn't know existed.
Yes. The text interprets this as the ultimate rule of universal justice. A society or an individual will never face destruction. They will never hit the ultimate consequences of their actions until the rules, the clear, rational consequences of cause and effect, have been made explicitly clear to them.
Ignorance is a valid defense.
But once the message is delivered, once the permanent values are laid out and the dawn is broken, the law of requital takes full effect. The black box is recording, the grace period is over, and the consequences of your initiative are mathematically guaranteed.
Okay, let's take a breath and zoom out to summarize this incredible blueprint we've just walked through over the last hour. We started by asking a deeply human question: how does a comeback actually happen? And based on this deep dive into Lecture 3 of 17, we've seen that a true comeback doesn't rely on magic, luck, or arbitrary divine favors.
Right, it's all mechanics.
It relies on a clinical, rational adherence to permanent laws. We've learned that our fate isn't a script pre-written in the stars. It is a ledger written by our own daily choices, fastened securely to our own necks. We've seen that short-term haste, the desperate starving grab for immediate gain, is the absolute enemy of long-term survival, and that extending our timeline is the only way to spot the poison in the pulau.
Beautifully summarized.
And finally, we've realized that we can't outsmart or spin the system because our own unconscious minds are keeping the ultimate, undeniable ledger of our true motives.
It really is a profound paradigm shift. It moves us from a passive, victimized view of destiny to a fiercely active, hyper-responsible view of human existence. It's empowering, but it carries a massive weight of accountability.
It really does. It leaves you with a lot to chew on regarding your own daily choices. And this sets us up perfectly for where the source material goes next. Because if you think the individual accountability is intense, wait until we scale it up to the societal level. In Lecture 4 of 17, covering Ayat 16 through 22, we will look at the point of no return. What happens when the affluent elite, the mutrafi of a society, ignore these exact laws, and why does the Quran say this leads to inevitable catastrophic destruction? You won't want to miss that.
To close out today's deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Think about your own open book right now. If your unconscious mind were projected onto a screen for you to read today, completely stripping away all your clever PR and rationalizations, what short-term profit in your life would be suddenly revealed as a devastating long-term loss?